Hey Amarillo, I'm Jason Boyette, and you're listening to Hey Amarillo, the interview podcast featuring some of the most interesting people and stories of Amarillo, Texas. Today's guest is Stephani Serna. Stephani lives here in Amarillo, but works for Porsche. I should say Porsche, in the company's financial services division. She began working for the car company after several years in local banking. Stephani grew up in Amarillo, but was born in Mexico, which means she spent most of her childhood here in the High Plains without legal immigration status. Stephani was a DACA recipient, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And the story about how she came here and how she grew up in extreme poverty is harrowing. And yet she found success. She graduated from college. She even gave a TEDx talk about her experiences throughout her childhood. And I should also say that one of the major influences on her life was Mission 2540, which is a nonprofit operated by my brother Brooks. And we discussed that a little. This is a really great story. Here's Stephani Serna. Stephani Serna, welcome to the Hey Amarillo podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm honored to have you. Thanks for being willing to tell your story in this setting. And I want to start with you the same way I start with all my guests, and that's just to ask how you ended up in Amarillo. And I know that's probably a story in itself.
It's kind of a long one, but so I was born in Juarez, Mexico. My family and I, we were below poverty level. And so when you live in a developing country and you're in that poverty level, there's no assistance, if you will. You're on your own. Mm-hmm. And so my father, he would make piñatas at night.
Okay.
And so I would help him with the paper and get them all glued together. And then come daytime, we would stand on the side of the road and we would try to sell the piñatas. And that was our only source of income. So if he didn't sell anything, then we just wouldn't eat. I would eat, but my parents...
He wouldn't.
Right. And so it was very difficult standing on the side of the road, but I never felt the poverty level, which is strange because my parents always made it a game. And so although we were begging, if you will, for assistance on the side of the road, I always felt like my parents were just spending time with me.
Okay. Do you remember like the circumstances of your home, like what that was like,
yes,
where you lived and that kind of thing?
Well, my mom and I talk about that often. So we lived in a shack, like a small shack, no running water. We had a restroom kind of, I don't know. And so the way that my mom would take me a shower is she would boil the hot water outside in a fireplace. And then she would carry it inside, and then she would take me a bath that way. And so she would just run back and forth.
Right.
And but I never felt like, again, the poverty level, although I didn't have a bed, we didn't have water, we didn't have anything. It was just four walls, basically, that kept us from the storm when it was raining.
Okay. How old were you around that time?
We left Mexico when I was 5 or 6 years old.
Okay.
So at that time, my mom started to play a game with me, kind of a make-believe, right? Like a pretend play is what it's called. And so she would tell me that I was an American girl named Angelica.
Okay.
And so we would play, and she's like, okay, you have to remember this line. This is who you are. You're Angelica. Hi, Angelica. How are you? And little did I know that's because that was my way into the United States.
She was preparing you.
Yes. And so it was a game that I thought was a game, but it turned out to be my entire future. So as we're playing these games, I'm rehearsing this girl's birthday, where she lives. She lives in Guyman, Oklahoma. And then one day my mom said, okay, it's time. And I'm looking at her like, I don't know what you're talking about. And we get into this car and she says, I will see you soon. And so I'm in the car. My mom has a rosary in her hand and she's praying because she's nervous, and she shuts the door and she doesn't get in with me. And so I fell asleep. So I never had to rehearse these lines, but my mom and my dad, they actually walked the desert to get into the United States, but then they paid thousands of dollars for, illegally crossing me over to the United States. And so that landed us in Guyman, Oklahoma.
Were you in the car with other people?
Yes.
Strangers?
Okay. I don't know. There was a little lady, she was an older woman, and she made me as comfortable as she could. I remember she was like, it's okay. Like, you're going to see your parents after a couple hours. But I mean, knowing now the circumstances that it takes to walk the desert, if they wouldn't have made it, I don't know what would have happened to me if I would have been processed back or been put in a foster home. So I'm thankful that they were able to endure the desert and then meet me in Guyman. So
how long were you separated?
I think it was about a whole day that I remember, because we've never heard trains before. Well, number one, big trains. And then we've also never heard the tornado alarms. And so when in Guyman, Oklahoma, they have tornadoes about every day. And so I remember we just got reunited in this home with, we didn't have our own house. So it was a bunch of undocumented immigrants living together. And then we hear this huge alarm going off. And so we're standing outside, everybody's standing outside, and we don't know what's going on. And then come to find out, that is when I learned what a tornado is, which is one of my first English words.
Welcome
tornado.
To the United States. Did your parents have a plan? Like, did they have work lined up, or did they have family that they were trying to meet up with?
So I know in Guyman, Oklahoma, there's a pig plant, and they hire a lot of undocumented immigrants because it's work that not a lot of Americans want to do, right? So they get whoever wants to do it, and some people like my mom and my dad, they don't have another choice, and so they took on that role. And now at this time, my mom became pregnant, and so my little brother, and we lived in Guyman until my mom gave birth. And then the ICE came into the building, and my dad got deported.
Okay.
And so it's just me and my mom while she was pregnant. I knew about stress then because my mom is stressed out, pregnant. She's undocumented. She can't work at this point. And then the worst thing that could happen happens. My brother is born premature, 1 pound.
Wow.
So he's airlifted from Guyman to Amarillo, Texas from the Lifestar helicopter. Well, my mom doesn't have a driver's license. My mom's never had a car. My mom's never had to drive. And so I had to break that curse, by the way, because it took me into my 20s to break that curse. Yeah. But anyway, so we get to Amarillo, Texas, and we're at the hospital. And I remember the social worker comes up to me because I'm the only one that speaks English.
And you're still what age at this point?
At 7 years old.
7, okay.
Yes. And she says, where are you going to stay? And my mom's like, well, we don't have anywhere to stay. We were just going to stay here. And my mom had some pillows she grabbed from the couch, and she just laid them out. And lady's like, well, we have something called the Ronald McDonald House. Mm-hmm. And I've never met anybody else that stayed this long, but we lived there. We lived there for 6 months.
Okay.
Until my brother passed. And so that was my entire time is at the Ronald McDonald House. Dr. Nazem, he took care of my brother, and I don't know, the hospital tried to make it as childlike for me with gifts, and the Ronald McDonald House, they were so kind. They let us live there. They gave us clothes, they gave us food, and we stayed there up until my grandparents came over so we could get an apartment at the Fairfield Apartments.
Okay.
And so we lived there for 6 months.
Your brother didn't survive?
No, he unfortunately did not. It was one of my first traumatic experiences because as the oldest, I'm the one that's translating. So I'm translating a funeral for my brother. I'm translating to the funeral director. He's asking me what color casket, and I'm young and I don't understand I understand death at this point because I understand he's not going to wake up, but I don't understand the extent of what I'm saying. Right. So I had a thick accent at the time. I'm barely learning English, and I'm having legal conversations with funeral directors.
I can't imagine that.
So
Were you having to do that in the hospital as
Yes.
well?
My mom, I remember whenever we signed the DNR, I was telling my mom, I was like, the nurse is telling me that they're not going to resuscitate him. And she's like, what's that? I'm like, I don't know. And so she's like, well, what does it mean? And my mom, I know now as a first-time mom, she made some mistakes and it's not her fault, but I understand she was extremely frustrated with me because I don't understand a medical document.
Of course.
But anyway, so she made the choice to sign the DNR because my brother had multiple brain surgeries and heart surgeries, and nothing was getting better. It was getting worse, actually. And so she decided to let him rest. And then we waited for my grandparents to come over to the United States, and that's when we moved to the Fairfield apartments at the time.
Your grandparents were still in Mexico?
They were still in Mexico. And they, mental health is such a problem. And my mom, being now a single mom, having to grieve her child without the support of my father. And because my father, when he got deported, I don't know if people know this, but when that happens, you don't just get sent over back to your country. You have to serve time.
Right. There's a detainment element of it.
And sometimes you serve the time that you were in the United States. So he was in prison for years until they let him go.
Okay.
So my grandparents came over to help the burden, if you will, of that. And so that's whenever we moved into the north side at these apartments called the Fairfield apartments. And they were in a bad area, of course. So we lived there with my grandparents at the time, and then my sister and several other people in a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 restroom.
Wow. Okay. You decided, though, or I guess circumstances decided for you that you were going to stay in Amarillo instead of trying to go back to Guyman.
My mom's whole thought was that her son is buried here.
Okay.
And so she didn't want to leave a part of her here. She wanted to stay here. And so we did, and then we just stayed and planted our roots here.
Do you remember going to school at that point?
Yes.
And you were still undocumented. So what was that like?
It was a lot. I was in ESL classes up until middle school, actually.
What school did you go to?
I went to Whittier.
Okay.
Whittier, Travis, and then Palo Duro and Caprock. And then my entire life was in the north side. And I'm very proud to be from the north side, by the way. But I remember just not having clothes. My mom would stand in line at I'm not sure what it's called now, but at that point it was the Bethesda Outreach Center.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So that we got clothes from there. There was another one called the Evelyn River Foundation.
Right. They did a coat drive.
Yes,
and had a
the
lot
coat drive, the toy drive. My mom did everything possible so we never felt like we didn't have what we needed. And so a lot of it was handouts. A lot of it was nice people who decided they wanted to help. And one of those people, I'm sure you know who that is, Brooks. He Mission 2540. So during this time, it was a lot of anxiety for me being around an environment that I miss my dad. I just saw my brother's death. I'm the oldest. I'm being pressured into education, and all I have to my name is an alien registration number.
Right. And
so Brooks comes to the door, and, we're undocumented. So whenever there is a Caucasian man at the door, it's kind of a scary situation. Yeah. But he invited us to go eat snacks and play games. They had this event, kind of like a clubhouse, if you will, at the apartments. And so we went, and we kept going, and he kept coming back. And he told us a story about the greatest love story of all time, right? The one where someone sacrificed their own son for love to make sure that you have grace and you have mercy. And that ultimately changed my entire path because, for a long time, I was angry. I would get into a lot of fights, actually, because people would pick on me for my accent and because of the dirty clothes or the clothes that we had. We just didn't have anything. And so when you get a sense of hope and love, it changes your attitude to everything because you feel seen, you feel heard. You're no longer just a kid who had to stand in line for Christmas presents, but you are the one that he loves, right? The one that Jesus died on the cross for. And that really changed my life to understand the perspective that I matter.
Okay. How old were you when you began participating in my brother's ministry?
I was the first one, so 20 years ago. So I was 9.
Okay.
9.
And what was that like, knowing that your family was Catholic? You know, you mentioned your mom having a rosary. My brother and my family, we're not Catholic. Was that something that was difficult, or was it okay to see beyond it? Because the kids that he works with, some of them are, you know, Muslim kids from Afghanistan, I mean, all kinds of religions and ethnicities.
Right. So it's funny because my grandpa was very upset for a long time when I started asking him questions about the differences. Because I would have to go in to do my first communion. My grandpa forced me, may he rest in peace, but he forced me to do my first communion in the Catholic Church. And I had a lot of questions because my path with God looked a little different now.
Right.
And so they were not on board. My grandpa, he's just very traditional. He's very traditional. So that part of it was difficult. But I think that my mom was just happy to know that somebody was there for us. My mom worked, all night. She was never home. And so I stayed with my grandparents who, they didn't speak English. They were elderly. And so for most of the time, I was just outside. And, those circumstances when you're outside in the north side and you're a small girl, it can lead to some pretty horrible things.
Right.
And so there's gangs, a lot of gangs around us. There's a lot of teen pregnancy around us. Even younger than that, I remember a couple of girls that I went to school with that were even younger when they had babies. And fights and drugs, and to know that somebody there wanted different for us or gave us a story of what it's like to want different for you. So my mom was just happy that someone was there willing to give us a more positive atmosphere.
Okay. What was your mom doing at the time? Did she find work?
Yes, my mom was a night custodian. So whenever we would wake up, my mom was asleep. And so I would get ready for school. And then when I would come back, my mom was already working. So as a night custodian, you work all night. And then she'd just come home tired.
Okay.
So it wasn't because she wanted to, but it was the only job that she could get.
Did that fear of the authorities, finding out that you were undocumented, did that persist like all the way through high school? Is that just something a burden that you carried the whole time?
Yes, I was always so scared to get in trouble. I stayed away from everything. I was very sheltered growing up. There's a lot of things that I wanted to do, and I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to do all these things, but I always held back because I just felt like, number one, I had an accent, so I've never been a confident speaker, even though I was translating, which is kind of a weird scenario there. But I, for the most part, just stayed home. And that was just because I knew that I was the only voice my family had. I was the only one that could translate. I was the only one that could go up to the grocery store clerk and say, hey, my grandpa's sick. What medicine do you recommend? So I have this burden to not only take care of my family, but make sure that they're here in a country where someone can understand them. And if they needed help, then I'm there to provide that help. So most of my life has been more of a caretaker for my family. And that started at a very young age.
Yeah, you mentioned the mental health aspect with your mom. I'm interested in how it impacted you, because that's a lot of weight for a teenage girl to carry. Where you're responsible for your mom, your grandparents, your family, all their communication. Like, you're in the middle of all these things that typically parents try to protect their kids from,
Right. I have struggled with anxiety my entire life, and I always thought that it was normal. Like, that was just a normal feeling that people have up until I sought counseling for myself.
Okay.
And I realized that, number one, it's not healthy to carry the burden and to feel the guilt of needing to be successful and needing to do all these things because you're the first generation, you are the oldest. And so I had to give myself that same grace that Brooks taught me. I had to give myself that same love and kindness. And I still struggle with it because it was years and years of me, being the front line for my family and having to translate and having to, do everything, restaurants, the doctor, everything. I was the one that had to tell them my grandpa has heart pain. And there are words that I had to sit there and learn how to say, because I don't know, I had an accent growing up, but in my mind, I felt like if I had an accent, people would know that I was undocumented. So that's part of the reason I don't have an accent now.
You worked to
I worked
lose it.
very hard to lose my accent. And I wish I could go back and, I don't say that it makes a difference now in my success or my career, but I felt like that was part of me. And I just didn't want it to be. I wanted to be American. I wanted people to think that I was from here, and they didn't have any suspicion or at all to know that I was undocumented and living under the shadows of that.
You mentioned success. I know you ended up going to college. Was that something that you thought about as a kid, or was that something that you kind of just found as you went through high school that you were able to succeed in that world?
So whenever we first got to the United States, in Guyman, Oklahoma, there was a lot of OU sweaters and OU jackets. And I remember my grandpa was like, you can go there. And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. And so that was always such a weird, like, in my head, the way that I would say is a little girl from the north side who's undocumented, they don't go to college, right? We stay here. We take care of our families. We just get a job and figure it out. And then I go do what my mom does. And then it's just a repeated generational cycle. And so in my junior or senior year, they announced DACA. And that changed everything, because for the first time in my life, not only did I not just have an alien registration number, but I had my name on an actual ID. It said Stephani Serna. And that, to me, because it gave you like a sense that you actually exist, right? You actually are a person in this state. And so I remember at that point, my the high school counselor was like, hey, you can go to college. You know that, right? And I'm like, well, I just got my ID. I don't know. And so we talked a lot about what that looked like and where I wanted to go. And to me, it just felt like a dream, right? It was just like, oh, of course, I'd love to go to college. But in reality, what can I afford? Like, my parents are living paycheck to paycheck, and my big dream is to go to a big D1 school out of state. It's just never going to happen. And so it didn't happen right away. But whenever I applied for college, they gave me a big academic scholarship, and I had a cheerleading scholarship on top of that. So I stacked it. And so I went to Southern Nazarene University first.
Okay. Which is outside of Oklahoma City?
Yes, Bethany, Oklahoma.
Right.
And I will say, although that seems like the success, right? Like that was good, and oh, you made it to college. It was not. I struggled so hard as a first generation immigrant in college. I mean, it was rough. I didn't have a clear guidance of like my time, because to me, I was always in survival mode.
Right.
That now,
well, you grew up in survival mode, right?
And so now I'm having panic attacks in class, and I just can't figure out why I've made it to college. My parents, my grandparents dropped me off and cried. I've never seen my grandpa cry, actually, until he dropped me off in college. And I just can't figure out or pinpoint what is wrong with me. Why am I anxious to be here? And I think it's because for the first time, I wasn't responsible for anybody else but myself. And I didn't know what not living in survival meant.
Right.
And so that, and then of course I still felt the disparity of being low income, because I met some other people who were low income as well, and we all became a group of friends, and they told me, you need to get some food from the caf because on the weekend they're closed. And then if they're closed, or you just don't eat, because we didn't have money to go to McDonald's, we didn't have a car. And so if the caf is closed, then there's no food to eat. So that I felt that disparity then. And then, of course, during the parent weekend when the parents come and they stay, and my parents never came.
Right.
And that honestly was kind of the entire narrative in my growing up. My parents never came
Had your dad been able to reconnect with the family by that point, or did he have to stay in Mexico?
He had to stay in Mexico. He tried to cross one more time and then was detained at the border again. So he tried, but it's just difficult when you've been detained before and then also deported,
right.
that you're kind of on the radar at that point. But I mean, I appreciate my parents and everything they worked for, but I always felt like I didn't want to go to any of the recognitions. I actually didn't even walk when I graduated.
Really?
Because I knew no one was going to be there.
Okay.
So from SNU, I went to OU. And the reason for that is because I tore my ACL, and I knew that if I was going to get in debt, I'd rather get in debt at a bigger school.
Okay.
And so I did, and I went to OU, and it took me a very long time to graduate. But I did. And then I got my mass communications degree, which I wish I wanted to be a journalist for such a long time. And I wrote for the school newspaper, but I was not successful in finding a job. So bottling up, then it's just like I get to the point where I feel successful, and then nobody tells you that whenever you graduate, there's not exactly a job lined up for you.
Yeah.
So that part kind of hit me in the face, because at that point I had my son. And so it was difficult, to say the least, to come back to Amarillo and not have a job, even though I have a college degree. So I went to work at the bank at Chase first. And then I was a teller. So that opened my door. I always say just a teller, but that's not exactly true, because that just a job opened up the door for a financial job. So Chase taught me what a banking institution looks like. And so then I left there to be a relationship banker at Bank of America. And then from Bank of America, that opened up a bigger door, because now I understand what loans and credit looks like. And then now into Porsche on the financial side of things.
So a couple of questions before we talk about your job now with Porsche. What was the path to citizenship like for you? Like, did you know, okay, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, I'm going to get to a place, as a DACA recipient, where I don't have to worry about this?
Actually, it was really, really, really long and expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I got my green card, my mom married a American citizen. My stepdad, he's the one that passed, and the one that was my father since I was 9-10 years old.
Okay.
So he gave my mom a green card, and then in return, she was able to help me get a green card.
Okay.
And so because of that, what happens is when you come here undocumented, you have to go to the Mexican consular in Mexico, not here. You go to the consular there. And I remember they give you a ticket. So you're waiting for hours for your ticket to get called up. And so you're going into Mexico without the actual confirmation that you were going to come back, because it's up to the person in front of you whether they're going to forgive you or not. So it's my turn. And she says, "Why did you do it?" And I'm like, well, and she's asking me as a child, like, why did you do it? And I'm like, well, I didn't have a choice.
I was 6.
Yes. So she looked at my mom, and of course, the shame on you. You shouldn't have done that. And I understand that. However, I was a child. So thankfully, they went ahead and granted me the green card, but it's a whole process. So we had to stay in Mexico for 2 weeks until they processed all the paperwork. And then once they processed it, they gave me a temporary card, if you will. And then I was able to come back into the United States with a green card. Now, the green card, you have to renew every 10 years. So you're a permanent resident, but of course, you're not allowed to vote. You're not allowed to do certain things. And then there's just a lot of differences, of course.
And there's still a lot of uncertainty attached to it. You don't feel the security that I might feel having been born here, because there's just a lot that remains in doubt.
Right. And, you know, when you have a green card, there's a lot of things that can happen. It can be a traffic stop or some kind of violation, because it's not a for sure thing that you are now going to be in the United States as a born citizen. This is just, you are a temporary person, if you will,
right,
at any point that can get revoked. So I wanted to apply for my citizenship, and I did. And that process took a really long time for two reasons. One, because of the pandemic. It was around COVID. And so everything was delayed. And then the process itself, they vetted me again for my citizenship, which I thought was so odd, because for DACA, you get vetted one time. You get vetted to make sure. And for DACA, I'm sure you know, but you have to be here. I don't know the exact year, but you have to be here at a certain age as a child.
Right.
And then you can't have any misdemeanors, any felonies, anything like that. So clear track there. And then the green card, you get vetted. But then I got vetted again for my citizenship. So that vetting process took a long time, which was extremely frustrating for me, because at this point, I've been in the United States for so long. I've never been in trouble. I've never done anything wrong. And so that took a long time. And then the test. If I hadn't gone to school here, that exam was actually quite difficult.
I think you could give that exam to anybody. You could give it to me, and I don't know that I would pass it. Like, it's a hard test.
Yes. And so at that point, it was under Trump's presidency. So the actual exam was 125 questions. Well, you get 10, but there was 125 questions. And some of them were, who's the president of the United States? But some of them, it's like, so tell me about the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment and what they did. And to somebody, like, I just think of my mom. My mom's a citizen, and she studied so hard for that test. But I just think of her and, like, how she didn't go to school here. My mom has a middle school education in Mexico. How does she pass? I don't know.
I respect that so much, because I know I could go to anyone in my family right now and say, tell me about the 14th Amendment, and they would have no idea.
Right.
You know, and so it is like, as much as immigrants can be demonized in our society, or even DACA recipients or anything like that, the work you have to do to become a citizen, like, is so impressive to me. And I just feel like if everybody knew how hard that process was and how long that was, to doubt, you know, your commitment to living here and to being a good citizen and all that stuff, like, just doesn't make any sense to me.
I know. One of my frustrations is people who don't vote. I know,
exactly.
To me, it makes me so angry, because if you only knew the debts that I took to be able to vote. I actually voted for my first time ever in this primary election, and I cried.
Yeah.
And my son was with me, and he's like, well, everybody votes. Why are you crying? And I'm like, one day you're going to understand the story behind this. It's a right that not a lot of people have, and a lot of people would kill, honestly, to have. And so it's one of my biggest frustrations is people who do not register to vote.
I hear you, and I'm glad you brought that up. Okay,
yes.
So you mentioned that your job started here with Chase, and then through multiple banks has landed you in the finance world, and that you're working for Porsche, which I think a lot of people will find interesting, because you still live here in Amarillo. So tell me sort of how that job came about and how it works with you doing it remotely.
So I got a LinkedIn message from a gentleman, and it was a staffing agency at first. So I don't have a business degree. And for most of those careers, they want a accounting, some kind of business degree. And when he messaged me, I was like, Porsche, what is that? And then I looked it up, and I'm like, oh, the German car company. Okay. So then I kind of thought it was a scam, because
most of what I get on LinkedIn, I assume is a scam too.
So I was a little hesitant. And then I was like, well, you know what? This is a work from home position. This is the money that they're throwing on the table is a lot more than I make now. And I mean, what's the worst that can happen? I go to the interview, they say, no, I still have a job. Mm-hmm. So I go into the interview, and one of their processes was a video interview. So they asked you 4 questions, and you record yourself, and then you answer it, which was extremely awkward.
Yeah.
And then the STAR method. So it was just different. but they liked me, which I thought was kind of weird because I just didn't think that it would go anywhere. I mean, it's a big company. And so one of the first things whenever I had my one-on-one meeting with the hiring manager, he was like, where are you from? The staffing agent was like, where are you from? I said, well, I live in Texas, but I'm from Mexico. He's like, okay, you live in Texas. How do you pronounce this? And I said, Porsche? He's like, no, please don't.
That's the first question.
Yes, it's Porsche. And I'm like, okay, Porsche.
That's not how people say it in Amarillo. I'm
right.
sorry, right?
So I'm like, well, in Texas we say Porsche, but okay, Porsche. So that was, number one, we had to get that out of the way. But he prepped me, and I just told him my story on why I want to work there and because Porsche, we have consumers, right? Mm-hmm. And the whole thing is about white glove level service and the luxury experience. And I said, that's because I've done that my entire life. I've literally been the white glove level service for my family. I've been the one that's taking care of everything. And so that's what I strive for in all of my positions. And so they hired me as a contractor for about 4 or 5 months. And then they hired me full time.
Okay. And
my first time ever going into the office in Atlanta, Georgia, I was in shock because I don't know if you know this, but it's the same building they use in the Avengers. So in my mind, I'm like, this is the Avengers headquarters. Yeah. And so it's beautiful. You see the 911s, you see the track. So to me, that was just such a crazy feeling. Like, I work here. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that moment for me was a very proud moment, because coming again from living in a little shack to now standing in front of headquarters, in front of this billion-dollar company, and saying that I have, my email address has @Porsche behind it.
And not just a billion-dollar company, but a company that is associated with luxury. I mean, it's a luxury brand that's known all over the world. Can you talk at all about the kind of work that you do? Like, what's the scope of what you're doing for Porsche? So
I work for Porsche Financial Services. Porsche is the big name, right? And then there's several different entities. We have the dealerships, we have us, the finances, and then we have several other brands. But the dealerships.
And those other brands are major luxury car brands. I mean, yes. Bugatti, Lamborghini, Bentley.
Yes. So we provide financing to all of them. So we're the luxury car finance bank, if you will. Okay. So Bugatti, Lamborghini, Porsche, and Bentley. And the Bugatti accounts, let me tell you, the first time I ever came across a Bugatti account and I saw how much they pay a month, I thought there was an accounting error, because I've never seen anybody pay what somebody makes a month on a car. But that's a thing.
That's a thing.
So Porsche Financial Services, we're an indirect lender. We get all of our deals from the dealerships. Okay. So the dealerships initially own the vehicles, and then whenever it comes time, they have incentives to coming with us because we're Porsche. So for leasing and retail accounts or so have you, then we give incentives to the dealership for providing us funds. So that's what we do. We're the bank.
Yeah.
And
you manage that stuff.
Yes.
From here, right?
Right. So I get to work from home, and it's wonderful. I mean, I actually was sitting back because I gave a TED Talk. I gave a TEDx talk in front of Porsche, our company. We had an annual company meeting. And while I'm sitting there preparing and I'm looking around my office, and I'm just like, this is insane. Like, sometimes you just can't believe, like, what you prayed for is right in front of you.
Right.
And so I had to take back a step because I was so nervous to give this speech. It was 12 weeks of planning with TED. So every Tuesday or Monday on the dot, we were in classes, listening to TED Talks, reading books, getting us prepared for the biggest speech of our life, right? And now I'm TEDx certified, so probably doesn't sound like it. So I am getting ready to give this speech. And one of the things that I can't remember what TED Talk this was, but she said, walk around the room and find the people in front and find a familiar face and speak to them. I was like, okay, well, I'm nervous. I'm going to walk around. We did it in the Delta Flight Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. So it's beautiful. It's like what dreams were made of, right? So they have the huge aircrafts, and then they brought in the 911s, and it's packed. So we're doing our mic check. And again, my family's not there. But one of the things that I vividly remember is the waiting staff, they were getting everything ready, and they were all Hispanic. And I'm the only Hispanic immigrant that's giving a speech. And when they're doing the mic check, I just said, my name is Stephani. I was born in Mexico. And they all looked up. And I don't know, the way they looked at me, I think it's the way that I've looked at other people. Like, I can do that. You can do that. Why can't I? And so they clapped. And in fact, when I gave my speech, they all came out of the kitchen and stood on the wall and just listened to my story because it resonated with so many of them. And it was just so cool to see another Mexican person standing there and saying their story. But going back to when I scanned the room, we had a little break in between for some water, and I scanned the room, and it made everything worse because the first tables that are sitting there is the CEO, is the president, and he's like, you got this. And I'm like, why would you sit there? Why would you do this? But I went up there and I gave my TED Talk, and I got a standing ovation, which I wasn't prepared for because it is very scary, and it has been even now to go up and say, hello, I was undocumented for most of my life, and this is my story. And sometimes it's not accepting, and I understand we live in a world where there's a lot of divide on why and what your opinion is, but I think I was able to give some human aspect behind that, and especially DACA. I know DACA is such a topic in itself.
It is, yeah.
And so I was very humbled and very proud to stand up there. That was the first time that I stood up in front of a large crowd. But when I looked around, I think it all sunk into me like, maybe I am successful. Like, I don't know. To me, it's always been survival mode that just now recently I'm trying to stop that. You always have to do something. You always have to, I don't know. It's hard to break that mentality when I've been in that cycle my entire life. But when I stood up and gave that TED Talk, I think it all sunk in for me. And I was like, well, thank you to my family, because it was kind of a thank you to my family for sacrificing literally everything so I'm able to speak in front of a company like Porsche and give my success story, because in, statistics, that's not supposed to happen.
Right. This episode of Hey Amarillo is supported by Dr. Eddie Sauer, who practices general dentistry at Shemin Dental Group. Eddie has been my dentist since I was in college. He's taken care of my kids' teeth ever since their teeth showed up. Dr. Sauer is a national speaker on Invisalign, and he uses that technology to improve his patients' smiles and positioning. We've used it in our family with really good results. It's so much easier than metal braces, which I had when I was a kid. So you can learn more by following Shemin Dental on Facebook or visit shemindental.com. That's SHEMEN. Okay, I'm back with Stephani Serna. Stephani, this is the part of the show I call 8 Straight. 8 Straight is sponsored every week by Panhandle Plains Historical Museum and Canyon. It's the largest history museum in Texas, and I chose this for you. Its automobile collection includes the 1910 Zimmerman touring car. It was made by the Zimmerman Manufacturing Company, which was originally a company that produced horse-drawn carriages. And then they transitioned to cars in the early 20th century. And so the Zimmerman touring car was a luxury vehicle. It was known for having wood accents and leather upholstery, and is one of the rarest U.S.-made vehicles in history. So you can see that at Panhandle Plains. Learn more at panhandleplains.org. Okay, when you think of Amarillo 10 years from now, what do you hope for?
I would hope for less construction at I-40.
Yeah?
But I would say that with all the big companies that we're getting, just more things to do for families.
Okay.
I'd hope for a little bit more of the expansion for Kids Inc. per se, and just more things for families to do, because There's not a ton.
It's something, it's a conversation that so many people are having, because as we bring in big businesses, we have to make it an attractive place for those employees that are going to follow.
Right.
And if you're trying to bring somebody, say, from Atlanta to Amarillo, you've got to offer some stuff,
Right.
And so, yeah, it's important that we get those quality of life pieces that will draw people here. Okay, other than wind, what does this area have too much of?
Going back to that construction on I-40.
Yeah.
This is pretty much it. I mean, it's growing, and I like the improvement. So it is annoying sometimes when you have to go around, but I appreciate the hard work and keeping everybody safe. I mean, the growth, there's a lot of, when I moved back to Amarillo, I was shocked because Synergy, that area was not there when I left.
When did you come back?
I came back in 2017.
Okay.
And so
there's a lot of growth that happened.
I was shocked. Yeah. I'm like, we have this? So, it was shocking.
What does this area not have enough of?
To me, and this is my soccer family coming in. So my son plays soccer. I think we need some more indoor facilities for our kids to play in.
Yeah.
Because Kids Inc. is the only indoor soccer facility that we have. And then whenever come wintertime, it's for competitive adults. So right. there's like a weird gap between now and then that there's no soccer being played for these kids. So just going back to that Kids Inc. arena, I think it's very, very important because, our kids need it. They need something, they want to play, and it's cold out. So
yeah. Okay, I agree. What's your favorite local neighborhood?
My favorite local neighborhood is the Heights. So I grew up in North Heights.
Mostly where you were?
Okay. Yes, North Side, Pride here. And yeah, I hear a lot of negative connotations on the North Side because of crime or whatever it is. But if you've ever been to the North Side, they are some of the nicest and welcoming people that you'll ever come across. So I'm very prideful to be from North Heights and the people that come along with it.
I love the history of that neighborhood. Families going back generations to when it started. And you're right that there's a lot more to that neighborhood than most people probably think if they've never been there or if they've only driven through,
Right.
What's your favorite local restaurant?
I have two answers for this.
Okay.
One of them is in the Heights. It's Delvin's.
All right.
They have, in my opinion, biased, but the best barbecue in town. It is very, very good. So if you've never been to Delvin's, it's on Hughes Street, and it's very, very good. The other one, because I love good Mexican food, is La Pasadita.
Okay.
So that
Where's
one, it is off of, trying to think here. It's on the north side. It's kind of a little hidden gem, if you will. But in my opinion, they have the best breakfast burritos you'll ever have.
Okay.
And they are handmade. The tortillas are handmade. You can have whatever you can customize your burrito. It's really good. It's called La Pasadita.
Authentic Mexican as opposed to Tex-Mex.
Yes, I actually went to high school, elementary, middle, and high school with the owner's daughter, and they're very nice.
Okay. What's your favorite local nonprofit?
Mission 2540. Mission 2540 has done so much for my family. I know that I talked a little bit about my stepdad, but we were very low income, and so my stepdad was diagnosed with diabetes. And a lot of people don't know this, but insulin isn't often covered, and it is very, very expensive. So we couldn't afford the insulin, so Brooks would step in a lot of times and buy the insulin for him. And so he kept him alive for many years. And then on the other side of that, because Brooks came in and for Mission 2540, he also taught me now what it's like to be a parent. And I think about this, I've been thinking about this a lot. I just don't know how your brother left his career like that. That is so crazy to me. But he had a calling and he followed his heart, and it truly shows for 20 years of faithfulness into this ministry. And so he did a lot for my family. He gave me hope. And I really think if he hadn't come into my life and showed me, not just even the religious aspect of it, but giving me the feeling that someone cares about you and that you matter, I don't think my life would be where it's at. In fact, when I gave my TED Talk in my little speaker bio, I put Mission 2540 on there. And there's a lot of people that had questions about what that was and what and why. And I let them know exactly what it is. And I said, Mission 2540 goes into low income apartments in neighborhoods, and they fellowship and they provide needs for these families. And sometimes that can mean help them not get evicted. It means providing them food. We just did the toy drive with Hillside Church, and I don't know the exact number, but I want to say it was a lot of toys that we gave out that day. So if stuff like that didn't exist, a lot of us wouldn't have a success story. And Mission 2540 is that one for me, because they're the reason why I even had Christmas gifts in the first place. I mean, and it's not about the gifts, but as a child, when you're the only one that doesn't have something wrapped around the gift, it does something to you.
Yeah.
And the fact that they made sure I at least had a gift, I had a jacket, I had a snack, Brooks has done a lot for me. So I think if it wasn't for Mission 2540, I wouldn't have been able to give a TED Talk, because my life would look a lot different than it does now.
I remember that very first year after he had done his ministry for a year, and he was going to do the very first banquet. And he was talking, just the two of us were talking. He was like, I don't know what I'm going to report in terms of results. People want to know, what are the results of what you're doing? How many kids are going to church now, or how many lives have been saved? And he was just like, I don't know. I've bought insulin for this guy a lot of times. And I didn't know that was, your family. And to now see that your life is a result of him doing those things, it's, 20 years later, that's an impact. That's a legacy.
Right.
Okay. What's the most underrated aspect of living here in Amarillo?
I would say Palo Duro Canyon. Honestly, it is really beautiful out there. We got to do the horse ride down there. And that was actually my first time.
I was going to say, was it something you ever got to see or experience when you were a kid?
No. And so I didn't know that existed here. And so, of course, we have Cadillac Ranch and the Big Texan,
and Buc-ee's now.
Oh, right. We did the Buc-ee's experience, and that was a lot. There's a lot of people in there. But yes, I love the Palo Duro Canyon. I think it's so pretty, and I don't think a lot of people know that it's there.
I think you're right.
So,
or at least they know it's there, but we tend to forget about it or ignore it or take it for granted.
It's so pretty down there. It's just kind of breathtaking to see that this is like our backyard. Yeah. Literally, it's just right there. So it's pretty cool to get to ride the horses down there and just take a step back from the busyness of life, family, career, and just stand in the awe of what that is.
So that was my last question. When was the last time you visited Palo Duro Canyon? When did you go and ride the horses? Was it just last summer, or?
It was in the summer, and it was actually really bad, but that was my first time ever in Palo Duro Canyon. Well, whenever growing up, do any of that stuff, we went to Wonderland one night, and that was on the free school night.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the things that I get to do now are sometimes, I don't know, I just have to step back and realize, you understand that this stuff is because of the success that you've been able to have, or, you're blessed beyond measures and you don't even realize it. So I had to take a step back there in the holidays too and realize, I know you're stressed out right now because of everything that's going on in work, but this is what you prayed for, and you get to live in a town that, to me, I like Amarillo. I know when I go to Atlanta, I'm ready to come back.
That's good. That's good.
Atlanta the traffic there is horrendous. Oh my goodness. In the airport, I have to mentally prepare myself like I'm going into combat. And when I go into the airport, they say it's the busiest airport.
It's a massive airport.
They say it's the busiest airport in the world.
Yeah.
And so whenever you go in, you have to have a plan. You got to have everything ready. I have TSA pre-check, but I'm still I'm ready. I'm game plan. No, the TSA agent's not going to yell at me this time. But I'm just ready to come home because Amarillo just feels like home. There's more stuff now to do, right, where you can go out to Synergy, you can go out to Buc-ee's, but you also get these familiar faces when you go. Someone knows, someone that knows you somehow or another. Somebody knows you.
That's always the case. Okay, so that concludes the 8 straight questions. I like to close by asking my guests to endorse something. So what's one thing you would like listeners to know about or to experience?
If you get the chance, I'm just going to go back to Mission 2540. If you can meet one of these kids, they would change your life, because it brings into perspective some of the stressful situations that you're in right now. If you knew the stories that some of these kids have, some of them are refugees from war countries. And if you got a chance to sit there and talk to them, and I'm not, demeaning or saying that our problems aren't as big as theirs, but you would have a different perspective of what the problems you're facing actually are in comparison to these children.
Yeah.
And so not only that, but you can make a big impact. One of my dear friends, her name is Suzanne Schroeder, and I met her through Mission 2540. And so she would come in and mentor, and she showed up to a lot of my events when nobody did. There was a scholarship night in high school at Caprock, and I received five scholarships that night, and she's the only one that came.
Wow.
So you never know. Whenever you volunteer, sometimes you just have to plant the seed, right? But if anybody has time, or if they just want to volunteer, if they want to donate snacks, then I'm sure you know where to guide them to.
I can send them to the right place.
But yes, Mission 2540, because it's life-changing, and you never know how big of an impact it might have later on somebody else.
Stephani Serna, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes the episode. I want to say thanks to Stephani for the interview. Thanks also to Shemin Dental and Panhandle Plains Historical Museum for supporting this podcast, and to Angelina Marie for editing every week. Thank you for listening. Hey Amarillo exists on a weekly basis because of listeners like you and the local people who support it financially through patreon.com/HeyAmarillo. Hey Amarillo's executive producers include Patrick Burns, Jason Burr, Katie Linger, Corey Burns, Josh Wood, Wes Reeves, Cindy Graham, and Barbara and Jim Whitten. This has been episode 386. My name is Jason Boyette, and I'll see you next week.